Good morning, everyone. I hope you all are doing fine. And guess what? Today we are going to continue our session on steps of research, and today we're going to talk about variable in research. So, what's a variable in research? Okay, imagine you're a detective in a mystery game. Okay, in research, variables are like the clues you find. They could be anything from a person or a place to an event or an object. Basically, a variable is anything you're trying to figure out or measure in your study. So, you see, there are types of variable in research, and we'll talk about one by one. It will start with independent variable, then we'll move to dependent variable, then active, attribute, continuous, discrete, categorical, extraneous, and confounding. And at the end, we're going to talk about demographic variable as well. So are you ready? Let's start our first variable, which is independent variable. So independent variables are the big players in your research game. They are the ones the research get to change or change to see what happens. Think of them as the cause. In a cause and effect relationship, these variables stand alone and aren't affected by others in your study. So remember that. So you'll hear people call them different names like explanatory or predictor or right hand side variable too, but they all mean the same. In an experiment, these are the variables you control or change to see the impact of what dependent variable. For example, imagine you're studying how sleep or the lack of the sleep affect test scores. Right. Here's the amount of sleep is your independent variable. You change it to see how it impacts the test score, which is your dependent variable. Isn't it that easy to understand independent and dependent variable? Right, so that's your independent variable. Next, we're going to talk about the dependent variable. So dependent variables are the opposite of independent ones. They are like the outcomes or reaction in your experiment. These guys depend on the independent variable. And if you change the independent variable, what? You will see a change in dependent variable. These variables are also known as a response, outcome, or left hand side variable. They are what you measure in your experiment. For instance, if you're looking at how much studying affects test score, the test scores are your dependent variables. They depend on how much a student studies or sleeps or even how hungry they are. I hope you get the point. And to sum it up, in your research game, you have independent variables that you control, right? To see how they affect the dependent variable, which are the outcomes or reaction. It's like a cause and effect relationship. So by understanding and manipulating these variables, you're trying to unlock the mystery of your research question. Remember, research is a bit like being a detective. You are always looking at how changing one thing, the dependent variable, can lead to change in another, which is your dependent variable. So I hope you got the idea about independent and dependent variable. Now next we'll move to another variable which is called active variable, and along with that we're going to talk about attribute variable. So active variable, imagine you're a scientist working on a project with tomatoes in a greenhouse. Okay, you decide how much water each tomato plants gets, and this is like having a remote control for the water. So you're kind of in charge, right? And that's an active variable. It's something you can change or play around as you like. Your decision about the water are what drive your experiment. And on the other hand, attribute variable, now think about things you can't really change, like your age or the color of your eyes. In research, we call these attribute variables. They're part of the study. You can't like change or alter. They just are what they are, but they are still important. For instance, in some studies, you might want to see if age affects how people respond to new video game. Here, age is an attribute variable, so it's an important part of your study, but you can't change a person's age, right? So that is your active and attribute variable. Next, we'll quickly move to another variable which is called continuous variable. So this one is a bit like a slider on a music app. It can smoothly move from one value to another, right, without any sudden jump. Continuous variables can take on any number within a certain range. Think about measuring the height of your classmates. Okay, you can't just say they are exactly 5 feet or exactly 6 feet tall. They could be 5 feet, or 5.34 inches, right? Or 5 feet 5.35 inches tall. So the number no can vary continuously. And another example is measuring the rain during a storm. It's not just going to be 2 inch or 3 inch. It could be something like 2.13 inches or 2.14 inches and so on. It's about all those in between and precise value. So does that make sense? We are basically, categorizing variable based on how we handle them in a study. Some we control, some we just observe as they are, and some can vary, smoothly within a range. So that is your continuous variable. Next is we have is discrete variable, and along with that we're going to talk about categorical variable. So let me tell you about the discrete variable. Imagine you have got some change in your pocket and you can count each coin, right? That's what a discrete variable is like. It's a type of data that you can count in a specific or finite amount of time. Imagine, think about it like the money in your bank account. Whether it's a few bucks or a million, you can count it up, right? But it might take a really long time to count everyone's bank balance in the world. But technically, it's still countable, right? The main thing is discrete variable are basically numbers with clear meanings. I hope it's clear that what is discrete variable. Next, we're going to talk about categorical variable. Now let's talk about categorical variable. And these are like putting things into different buckets or group. For example, think about your favorite ice cream flavors. You can group them into categories like chocolate based or fruit based or like nutty flavors, all this stuff. And these types don't have necessarily a numerical value. They are more about the type or category. There are three kinds of categorical variable. First is binary. This is like yes, no, or true and false kind of thing, right? And another is nominal. These are categories with no specific order, like different types of music like rock, jazz, classical, right? Another is ordinal, and these have a specific order but not necessarily a numerical value. Think of it like a movie rating: good, better, best. I hope you got the point, right? Example of categorical variables are things like race, gender, age groups, or education level. These are all ways to sort people or things into different groups or different category. I hope it is clear. Now next we have another variable which is called extraneous variable. So these are the kind of variables that aren't the main focus of your study but can really still mess up with your results, right? If you are not careful, they are like uninvited guests at a party who can either liven up or ruin the vibe. For example, say you're doing a study on how well students do on a test. If the room is super cold, some students might be too chilly to concentrate, right? And the room's temperature isn't what you're studying, but it could still affect the results. That's an extraneous variable. It's important to keep an eye on these variables because if they are not controlled, they can lead to wrong conclusion about what you're actually trying to study. So in short, when you're looking at data or doing research, always think about what kind of data you have, discrete or categorical or extraneous, and watch out for those, these sneaky extraneous variable that might, affect your conclusion. I hope it is clear, and in previous exam they have asked question based on that also. So in that perspective, this particular variable becomes more important that you should remember. And next we are going to talk about another variable, confounding variable, and again we'll also talk about demographic variable. And let's talk about confounding variable. Okay, so think of confounding variables are those, sneaky factor that again mess up with your research without you even realizing it. Right, they're like uninvited guests at a party, mingling with both the cause, which is independent variable, and the effect dependent variable of your study. Because they are so chummy or so clumsy with both, they can really, mess up your result. And let me tell you an example, and it will be clear. Right. So imagine you're trying to figure out if not exercising makes people gain weight. You might initially think, sure, less exercise equals, more weight, right? But hold on. What if the amount of food someone eats is also playing a role here, right? Maybe it's not just about exercise. Perhaps men are gaining more weight because on average they are eating more than women, right? And that's a confounding variable right there. It's a muddling up your result by having its own effect on weight gain. I hope it is clear what is confounding variable. Next we have demographic variable. So by the name, demographical, they are like the basic stats on a character in a video game. So they tell you who your subjects are, but you can't change them. They are set in stone. Researchers love these variables because they help understand who they are studying. When we talk about demographic variable, we're talking about characteristics like age, gender, race, or whether someone's married or not, how much education they have had, or even how much money they make. The researcher can use these, to group people and see how different groups, respond differently in your study. For instance, in a study, these demographic might be split into categories also, like male, female, different races, married or single, or they might be numbers like age, year, and also income, all these stuff. And this helps a researcher to get a clearer picture of the population they are studying, whether it's a whole country or just a small group of people, right? So in a nutshell, while confounding variables are those tricky factors that can mess up your finding, demographic variable are the solid unchangeable facts about your study group, and that helps you to understand who you are dealing with. And again, we're gonna talk about the next step, like conceptual framework. It's also very important because, this conceptual frameworks take it as a map or a sketch, that helps you to understand how various ideas or things you want to study are connected. It's like when you draw out a plan for how different parts of a project, fit together. And in research, this map shows the relationship between different things you're studying, which we call again variable, right? And these variables are just the features of aspects of something that you're interested in. To create this kind of map, researcher often, read a lot about what others have already discovered, that we already talked, right, at the literature review part, and they use these insights to build their own unique framework. Right, and it has also two types of variables, like moderating variables. Now imagine you're experimenting with plant growth. You're looking at how sunlight, that is your independent variable, right, affect the growth of your plants, which will be your dependent variable. So a moderating variable is like a twist in your study, right? And it's something that changes how the sunlight affects the plant's growth. For example, the type of soil could be a moderator, right? It doesn't directly make the plant grow, but it changes how the sunlight does its job. It's called a moderation or an interaction effect. It's like finding out that not just the amount of sunlight, but also the type of soil matters for your plant's growth. Then there is mediating variable. There are, things that behind the scene, right? And they explain why or how something happens. So back to the plant example. Let's say you find that sunlight indeed helps plant grow, right? But why? Maybe it's because sunlight increases, all that chemical stuff like chlorophyll, right? And that will be your mediating variable. So chlorophyll is not your main focus, right? But it plays a crucial role in concerning sunlight to plant growth. It's like a bridge that explains the process happening between your independent variable and your dependent variable. Now you must be wondering, right, why conceptual frameworks matter. Well, creating a conceptual framework is a bit like detective work. You're piecing together all these clues, these variables to solve a mystery, your research question, right? And just like a detective story, you come up with hypotheses. These are your best guesses or prediction based on your map. This cool thing is these hypotheses can be tested to see if they're right or wrong, and that's how you contribute to the big puzzle of knowledge in your field, right? And that's all, guys. In our next session we're going to talk about very important step like how to formulate hypothesis. And remember, in your exam every single time they ask about hypothesis in one way or the other, and in previous exam they asked about the hypothesis test, and that we'll talk about in our next session. So thank you so much and have a good day. I'll see you in your next session. Bye bye.